Thank you, Jeff Ditchfield, for agreeing to take part in the second webinar in our series, People and Psychoactive Plants. Jeff, you're one of the UK's best-known advocates of medical cannabis. You've written about growing cannabis, about preparing cannabis remedies. You're also an activist, a businessman, and an internationalist who now speaking to us from Negril on the eastern tip of Jamaica. Sensible place to be spending the winter. All this gives you deep insight into the policy disaster that is known as the war on drugs. And you like to quote Howard Marks that this is a war on people, and that as a citizen, you can either surrender or fight back. You obviously chose the latter. I'm suggesting that the rules of engagement are shifting now that we both have both the WHO and the UK government acknowledge that cannabis has medical properties. Going forward, what is for you the most important battleground, both in the UK and globally?
I think globally things are progressing quite well at different speeds. And I think as more governments get involved and change, like the Canadian government have and the Jamaican government, things will change more quickly and more dramatically. But in the UK, I hate to say it, but things seem to be going backwards.
Yes? Well why is that?
Well, there are numerous reasons, and it depends who you listen to. But I think an obvious one for me is that the ruling party at the moment in the UK, the Conservatives, the Tories, with their vested interest in the, shall we call it, a regulated license market, shall we say, they have some Tory members and ministers have vested interests, and they seem to be clamping down on people who are, let's face it, not so much breaking the Misuse of Drugs Act, but growing without a license, or cultivating without a license, to be more accurate, and producing cannabinoids even for their own use without a license is punishable by up to 14 years in prison, which is ridiculous.
Yes, of course, it's completely disproportionate. What do you mean by vested interests in the regulated cannabis market?
Well, just Google and research people need to Google and research the links between Tory ministers, Victoria Atkins, Theresa May and her husband, GW Pharmaceuticals, British Sugar. It's all there. We don't need to go into it in detail here. We'll, be accused of being conspiracy theorists. But the information's out there, and it's obvious that there are some senior Tories who seem to be making a lot of money out of prohibition. And the current prohibition in the UK, as Howard says, is an attack on people. And if your own government declares war on you, then in my mind, that's a civil war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's just park this idea about vested interests. Although we do, of course, have a very large pharmaceutical company in the UK, not far from where the University of Kent is based, GW Pharmaceuticals, who are, I think, the largest producers of cannabis medicine globally. Don't you think there is a real shift in the appreciation of cannabis and its medical properties?
Not globally, yes, but in the UK, no. And again, going back to the war on drugs, and first casualty, as we know in any war, is the truth. Propaganda is a big issue in war, and this is what seems to be trying to be achieved by the Home Office in the UK, is a distinction in the public's mind between illegal, dangerous skunk cannabis and safe pharmaceutical grown by British Sugar, GW Pharmaceuticals, or prescribed by a specialist consultant, and you can pay up to £1,000 for an ounce of this weed, but it'll be legal. And if you can afford it, you can go and see a specialist consultant, and you can get, say, a prescription for an ounce, maybe 2 ounces of weed a month. But you'll have to pay for it if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, you won't get it. And if you try and grow your own, then, yeah, you'll be suffering the penalties of the law, as we still see every day in the UK, people being taken to court for cultivating a few plants for their own medicinal use. And that's medieval. It's cruel.
From what you're describing, it seems to me there's a great social injustice going on. If access is conditioned by being the ability to pay.
Well, that's how it seems to me. And something I have noticed that is interesting since 2018, when cannabis, medicinal cannabis, was moved to Schedule 2, and it was allowed to be prescribed by some specialists in the UK. I've noticed some people who used to be, shall we say, quite active on the activism scene have gone very quiet in the last 12, 18 months. And when I've made inquiries as to, why have they gone quiet, it seems to be that, well, it's okay now because they have their own private prescriptions. So they have their own private prescription, which they're paying for. They don't have to worry about being arrested, being taken to court. And interestingly enough, they can drive their cars. Now, how can it be in the UK that someone who has a prescription for cannabis, who can afford it, can drive their car, but someone who smokes dangerous skunk cannabis, street cannabis, the cannabis grown by criminals, which will send you crazy, if you're detected with that in your bloodstream, you'll lose your driving license. So basically what it boils down to is that if you have a prescription for cannabis, the limit for THC in your blood is 5 times higher than if you're using or consuming illegal cannabis.
Oh, is that right? Higher?
Yeah. As if somehow, and as I said, this is why they seem to be trying to create this distinction between safe pharmaceutical cannabis, like they produce, and dangerous skunk cannabis that people like myself, the buddies, and people who are growing and cultivating for their own medicinal use. And what about the parents? I'm still getting contacted by parents, not so much now with children with epilepsy because they can get that prescribed from their doctor now, but I'm still getting contacted even here in Jamaica by parents who've got children who have terminal diagnosis for cancer, because there's no help at all in the UK for children who are suffering with severe forms of cancer. And again, it's a disgrace. Cannabis has never killed anyone, but prohibition is.
Of course. Now, years ago, when you founded Bud Buddies, you mobilized cannabis growers to supply cannabis medicines for patients in need. And I think you're still doing that. You're still providing cannabis to people who need it. But one of the things that, and you mentioned it already, how many former activists have gone quiet. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, when it came to Bud Buddies, what was the ingredient to make it such a success as a campaign?
Well, I think the thing with Bud Buddies is it's always been about fighting this huge social injustice and basically empowering people to be self-sufficient and look after themselves, because we always realized, even 20 years ago when we founded Bud Buddies, that we were all facing up to 14 years in prison.
Yeah.
So we were not a reliable source for people who needed cannabis, certainly for treating a terminal disease. So it made sense to us that people should be self-sufficient so they can look after their own needs. That way, it didn't matter what happened to us. If we went to court or we went to prison, people wouldn't be let down because they'd be self-sufficient. And that was part of the success of Bud Buddies, because as people became self-sufficient, they would then donate some of their crop back to Bud Buddies, and we would use that to help people to supply them with cannabis and cannabis preparations while their own crops and their own grow rooms were maturing and were learning how to grow. So generally, it'd take 3 to 6 months for people to get a decent grow on.
You know, there is so much factionalism in the cannabis movement, and what you're describing is something that eventually led to the cannabis compassion clubs, as a way of organizing growers and distributing or ensuring a fair distribution of the crop. But even so, they are all under the shadow of prohibition. So I often wonder, do you think they're actually viable?
Depends on your definition of what is a compassion club. I have seen and heard, and I've visited, and I'm aware of many clubs who call themselves compassion clubs, but I don't see a lot of compassion there. Now, I haven't really got a problem with that, because this is the great thing about a club. We're talking about private members clubs. Now, because they're private, not open to the public, to be honest, they can do what the hell they want. I mean, you could have a private Hitler group if you wanted to, as long as it's private, it doesn't offend people. So if there are clubs in the UK which, you know, don't do so much on the medicinal, but it's where, shall we say, recreational consumers or adult consumers just go to chill and relax, and there's, you know, nothing really medical going on there. Well, you know, that's fine as well. So there seems to be two types of clubs. There's the, for want of a better phrase, the adult recreational groups, and then there's the more medicinal. And I think the main emphasis, it depends the founders of that group. If the founders of that group have cancer or MS, there's going to be more of a, shall we say, medical emphasis in that group than, you know, some people just like to get stoned. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, here it's 10:30 in the morning and, you know, I'm smoking a joint, and why not? I mean, that's the thing about here in Jamaica. Totally different out here now.
Let me come to Jamaica in a second, but I just wanted to drill down into what I touched on, this factionalism that I see in the cannabis movement. And it makes you wonder whether, and I want to ask you, do you think that grassroots activism, if you pardon the pun, is enough to deliver policy change, or do you need something more structured?
Well, define activism in the UK. What is activism?
Well, your own work, for instance.
Yeah, well, you know, some people think it's being activist. They're being an activist by signing or starting a petition or sharing a petition. Personally, you know, I don't think a petition has ever changed anything in the history of anything. So I see them as a waste of time. Now, for me, certainly when it comes to an issue like this, I mean, we're talking about a classic victimless crime here. Now, people and children are dying in the UK because of this unjust law. Why aren't people out on the streets, like Paul Flynn asked a couple of years ago, begged for people to come to Parliament, to break the law, to challenge the law and see what happens? A few thousand activists turned up at Parliament, but a few activist groups, UKCSC, the UPA, and, you know, a few others that were around at the time, they'd negotiated with the Metropolitan Police that if you all stayed in this little safe area, it would be okay. No one would be arrested. Now, that's not what Paul Flynn asked. Paul Flynn didn't ask people to come to Parliament and sit in a little area listening to each other talk about how brilliant they are in a safe area. He asked people to challenge the law. And that's what I did. That's what I got arrested for. That's why I spent the evening of the 23rd in a prison cell in London because I did what Paul Flynn asked. Now, why didn't the other activists do that?
Okay, well, I can't speak for them. I remember I was there and I didn't.
I know you can't. This is something that me and Howard had a long conversation with one night in Spain, was about activism and, again, the war on drugs. Now, obviously, we know, call it what you want, Babylon, prohibition, the courts, the Home Office, the police. Yeah, that's, you know, that's one side of the war. The other side of the war is, you know, the activists, the people sitting in their safe zones, the people sharing things in Facebook groups and starting polls and starting petitions. And somewhere in the middle, like in any war between two armies, is no man's land. And that's where I feel I am. So I'm
Okay.
getting shit. I'm getting shit and attacked from both sides. But yeah, I'm in the middle because this whole thing needs to change. And I'm trying to pick my words very carefully here because I don't want to be spending the next week or so posting up on Facebook to all the little comments of people that don't like what I've said about what's going on in the UK. Well, you know, tough shit. Get out there, get active, challenge the police. If 1,000 activists went out and confronted a police officer in possession of 1 gram of cannabis or even half a gram of cannabis oil and told that police officer, like I have on many occasions, that they are in possession of that cannabis oil with intent to supply it to the parent of a dying child. That has been one of the charges on my last 2 arrests. Now, on my last arrest, they actually put that on the charge sheet. That was actually written on the charge sheet, that I admitted to being in possession of cannabis oil with intent to supply to the parent of a dying child. And I was charged for that. Now, when that got to Crown Court, 5 minutes before my case was due to start, because obviously I'd pleaded not guilty in magistrates' court, I'd demanding on a Crown Court trial. When I got to Crown Court trial, 5 minutes before it was due to start, the prosecutor, the CPS, came over to me and told me that he was discontinuing all the charges and I was free to go. I asked him why, and he just laughed and he didn't want to speak anymore. But you know, me being me, I pressured him, and again he laughed, rolled his eyes, and said, "You're going to plead not guilty. That's obvious." And I don't want to stand in front of a jury reading out what you're charged with. Because, yeah, that would be challenging the law. Because, strictly speaking, in that case, I had no defense in law. Arguably, the defense of necessity, duress of circumstances, that's the defense I used in my first Crown Court trial at Chester Crown Court, and I was found not guilty. Then we had the Quail Ruling. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah.
Well, the Quail Ruling basically said that people like me could not use the defense of necessity, duress of circumstances. And the judge in my trial had made an error in law in my first trial. So subsequently, no one has been allowed technically to use the defense of duress of circumstances, also known as necessity. It basically says it's a defense to break a law to avoid a greater danger. And a well-known example of this is, for example, if you were standing in a car park on the edge of a reservoir and there's a child drowning, and you see in a parked car which is locked a life jacket on the passenger seat, if you smash that window, you committed a criminal act of criminal damage. But you could use the defense of necessity, duress of circumstances, that was defense to you breaking that to avoid the greater danger. And that's the defense that my judge permitted me to use in my first trial at Chester Crown Court. And that's what the Court of Appeal said that I shouldn't have been allowed to use. Because they basically said that they didn't rule it out, they defined it. So what they actually said was that it could not be used as a defense for supplying cannabis to avoid serious injury or pain. That wasn't classed as important enough, if you like. First, they did not rule it out to avoid serious injury or death. Now, the way I've interpreted the Quail Ruling is if I supply cannabis or cannabis oil to someone with MS, for example, to alleviate their pain, I cannot use the defense of necessity, duress of circumstances, because the Court of Appeal is very clear. However, if I supply the same cannabis or cannabis oil to the parent of a dying child or to someone who has terminal cancer, then that is to avoid serious injury or death, in my view, and that is a defense that then can be put to the jury. Now, I'm quite happy to go into any UK Crown Court and have these arguments the CPS don't want me to.
Yeah, I can see you itching for that fight in the courtroom, and to force them to come out with a decision. Okay, but so we'll watch this space. But I wanted to come to ask you, how did you arrive at this conviction that you have about the medical properties and the capacity that cannabis has to arrest or to arrest cancer, perhaps to cure it, maybe? Because you yourself are not a botanist, you're not a medical doctor. By what route of research, of inquiry and self-taught investigation did you come to this?
Well, my whole interest, if you like, started about 20 years ago when a very good friend of mine who suffers with MS, I saw her and I hadn't seen her for about 6 months, and to be honest, she looked terrible. And I blurted out, "Christ, what's up with you?" And she explained to me that she hadn't had any cannabis for a few months, and I wasn't even aware that she, consumed cannabis. So that got into the whole conversation. She explained to me that she used it to treat her MS. She explained how it helped her, and I was fascinated by this. And then she explained that the reason for her bad state at that time was because the dealer she used to get cannabis from in Liverpool, he'd been arrested, remanded, so she had no supply, and she was so desperate. She started in her wheelchair going around pubs on the up and down the Dock Road in Liverpool. This is like in the late 90s, 2000. Just trying to score some weed. And sure enough, met a guy, took her out to the car park where he was going to sort some weed out for her. And he ended up pulling a knife on her, stealing her bag. And so she didn't get any weed. She didn't even report that crime to the police because she was scared that she would get into trouble for. And that's what started me thinking about this, because I was thinking at the time, well, it's a plant. So, if it helps her so much, why is it so illegal? And for about a year, I was just researching the illegality of it. And then I became aware that where everyone was talking about cannabis or marijuana, as a more popular term back then, that cannabis was a very, very interesting plant for me, because it's a whole chemical factory. A cannabis plant can produce, 300 to 400 chemical compounds. THC is obviously the one that, back then, got all the attention. But there's up to 100 cannabinoids. There's all the other compounds. There are up to 10,000 individual strains of cannabis. And the more questions I answered, the more questions I had, because if I answered one question, that would then, raise three more. And for example, going back to, I think it was around about 2004, when I opened the Beggars Belief, the private members cannabis club in Rhyl in North Wales, and Cannabis Cafe, we had a private members club there, and that's where Bud Buddies used to assist people with medicinal cannabis. And the way we used to operate there at our club, this is back in 2004, is that there were two classes of membership. We had white card members and green card members. The green card members were Bud Buddies members who had a recognised medicinal requirement for cannabis, and they basically got their cannabis for half the cost of what the white card, the adult consumers, paid. So the adult consumers were subsidizing the medicinal consumers who generally were on benefits. So it was a good system. It was a good system that worked there. And we also encourage people to grow their own cannabis and bring it into the club as well, and swap it with other members. So, and all this feedback from Bud Buddies added to our knowledge of which individual cannabinoids, which strains of cannabis assist with which conditions, which symptoms, and one particular interest, which is the anti-cancer properties, was back in 2004. I was contacted by a surgeon from London who came up to North Wales, and he was a brain surgeon, and he was telling me about glioblastomas, GBMs, glioblastoma multiformes, a brain tumor. Prognosis is generally 2 to 5 years. And his young wife, who was only early 30s at the time, she'd just been diagnosed. So he knew what was going to happen to his wife. And he was telling me that he'd heard that THC and cannabis could have anti-cancer properties. And did I know about this? And I did. So he told me more. And he told me about the research and the work of Professor Manuel Guzman at Madrid University. And that fascinated me so much that I went to Spain, went to Madrid University, got in contact with Professor Manuel Guzman. And through him, I met Dr. Cristina Sanchez and Dr. Guillermo Velasco. And Guillermo, for example, he's been researching glioblastomas, GBMs, for 10 years now. And his research indicates that an equal amount of THC and CBD is the optimum ratio of cannabinoids in treating glioblastomas, brain tumors. And there are clinical trials going on in Spain at the moment now, based on his research. Now, that's the sort of science and the sort of detail I want to go into, rather than, all the, shall we say, Facebook, cannabis is, magic cure. I wouldn't even call it a cure. Very effective treatment for a lot of things. But again, for example, when you're treating cancer, it seems to be quite obvious that people need to continue to take cannabinoids each day to stop cancer reoccurring. So why not permit people to grow some cannabis plants for their own medicinal use? Here in Jamaica, I forgot where I was for a minute, it's still sunny, but here in Jamaica, as well as having a legal regulated system out here where you can go into dispensary and buy cannabis and cannabis preparations, each household is permitted to cultivate up to 5 cannabis plants each, and carry up to 2 ounces in public, which, that's a great system.
I was going to come to the political aspect. And Jamaica, of course, famously amended its Dangerous Drugs Act a couple of years ago. Do you see other countries in the Caribbean following suit?
Yes, indeed, and some have, but it doesn't seem to be very big news in the UK. For example, St. Vincent, they brought in very similar regulations a few years ago. Other countries in the Caribbean have done similar. Jamaica, for me, seems to be the most progressive and seems to be the best system out here.
Of course, it also has more political weight than the other countries and the mini and micro states. Talking about a different island that you've been working in recently, it's the Isle of Man, where you advised the government on conducting or introducing political reforms on cannabis. How's that going?
As frustratingly as, dealing with any politicians. In private, there are some MHKs, the equivalent of an MP, out there who are very, very good. They're very progressive. There are some who, shall we say, being polite, are more conservative, and there are some who, to be honest, if they had their way, they'd probably bring back birching and make homosexuality illegal again. The politicians in the Isle of Man don't like to be reminded by me that I think it was in 2006 that homosexuality ceased to be a crime in the Isle of Man. So, they're not exactly progressive, but they have a great chance here, because what the Isle of Man did a couple of years ago, they held a national poll, and 99% of people who responded voted to permit adults to have access to cannabis medicinally and recreationally. Now, 2 years later, things haven't progressed in the Isle of Man, and people are still being taken to court. And I think, again, in the Isle of Man, I'm choosing my words carefully here. I think next time I visit the Isle of Man, I will possibly be directly challenging their law. Let's see if I can get a Manx jury. I don't seem to be able to get an English jury. Maybe I can get one in the Isle of Man.
We seem to be determined to pick that fight. Coming back to the mainland.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to say, but yes, I am very determined. But I'm 60 years old. I'm in Jamaica. I like to think of myself as retired. I shouldn't have to do this. If I didn't have to do this, it'd be great. No one would be happier than me if prohibition ended tomorrow. If cannabis in the UK was rescheduled to Class C, that's all it needs to happen. And that could happen today. Home Office can do that. Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs Act have advised many, many times that cannabis should be reclassified. There is no justification for keeping it in Class B. It should be Class C.
It was for a short time.
Yeah. The Labour Party did it for a couple of years.
David Blanket.
Yeah, exactly. But again, politically, it had to be moved back. Now, in the Isle of Man, this is something I've pointed out to them on many occasions, is they have the same power. They could reschedule cannabis as a Class C, and that would stop all the prosecutions. And that would stop police arresting people. And they could decriminalize up to 5, cannabis plants per person to be cultivated. That would be a great system. That's what the people of the Isle of Man want. But the politicians don't want it. And with the regulations they're talking of in the Isle of Man, again, they're talking about granting licenses on the Isle of Man to cultivate cannabis and export it, but not for the people of the Isle of Man. How crazy is that? Now,
everybody the world over is talking about export crops and export industry. I think that's a fantasy for politicians and some businessmen. But in the UK, I'm coming back to the mainland. Isn't there an opportunity there? We've had this extraordinary dislocation under COVID. Then there's Brexit. Is this not a time where the UK really could take a lead in regulating the cannabis industry and normalizing it?
Well, the thing is, the UK is taking a huge lead. The UK is the world leader. It's the largest exporter of cannabis. So it depends which medical cannabis. Well, but that's where the Tories are making their money. That's where Victoria Atkins and Theresa May and her husband Philip May. That's where, as I said, that's where they're making their money.
When you go to cannabis conferences these days, over the past couple of years, now they're webinars, it's been completely transformed. You have a lot of businessmen. You've got the arrival of big finance in the cannabis sector. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see this?
Inevitable, I suppose. I don't like it, but it's just, as I said, it's inevitable. What can you do? It's the way things are. Now, I've got no problem with all this, providing people have the option to ignore it all, like I want to, and just grow my own plants.
Right. So I think that's the key thing to insist on. During this whole, delegalization debate, that yes, maybe it's possible for large companies to invest and provide standardized products, but the right of individuals to grow should always be preserved. Jeff, I want to bring this to a close. You're in Jamaica now. When are you coming back to the UK?
No idea. I haven't been in the UK since 2019. Even if I wanted to go back to the UK now, I couldn't because there were no flights. So all flights were suspended. So who knows? Maybe later in the year. Maybe not even till next year. Now I have no idea. I can't really say that I'm missing the UK. Friends and especially family I'm missing, but again, apart from that, I've got weed, got ganja, got rum. Things are pretty good here in Jamaica.
Well, on that hearty note, Jeff, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you again on the 1st of April.
Yes, look forward to it.
Thanks very much.
Cheers,
Cheers
man.
now.